Now for our next talk, which I am sure is going to rock you and probably frighten many of you. I have heard it and I have been frightened. I am going to ask Mr. Robert Welch of the John Birch Society to introduce one of his latest employees.
On behalf of John and myself both, thank you very much. You're very kind. But I am just here to introduce a speaker, not to play any substantive role myself. So I'm not going to make the mistake of the man who introduced Chauncey Depew once. He saw an opportunity and he took it and he spoke for 1 hour introducing Depew. And when he got through and he said, "Now, ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Honorable Chauncey Depew, who will give you his address." Depew got up, picked up his briefcase, and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, my address is 14 Wall Street," and walked out. So, on the other hand, I'm not going to make quite the mistake of the man introducing me once. I thought it was a mistake anyway, who said, "If this fellow's any good, we want to hear him. If he isn't any good, we want to get it over with. I give you Mr. Welch." I would like to I don't need, certainly, to use up any valuable time in presenting John Rousselot. Most everybody in this audience knows quite a bit about him. So I'd like to call to your minds a quite flippant limerick that is going around. Some of you may know it. God's plan made a wonderful beginning until man spoiled his chances by sinning. I trust that the story will end in God's glory, but at present the other side's winning. Now, that, ladies and gentlemen, I want to point out is enemy propaganda. There are too many able, dedicated patriots who are determined to fight too hard and too courageously for God and country, which is the name of this rally and what you people are fighting for. This rally has brought many of these great Americans who are so determined together. Now you can get some idea of how desperately the collectivists, the enemy among us, fears the potential opposition of our next speaker from the way they concentrated so much of national left-wing strength, resources, and action, and every trick and pressure play in the book to get him out of Congress. If we had time to spare, I'd take about 20 minutes just to outline the incredible concentration and build-up and planning going back for more than a year against this man because of their fears of what he could do and his potential as an opponent. But they got him out of Congress by a quite small margin. But it may well turn out that the result of this gigantic campaign may have been to put this man in a position to accomplish far more in stopping the communist socialist advance than he could have done in Congress. For there are many facets, ladies and gentlemen, to this man's ability and effectiveness. He's a great student, a great speaker, and a man who always thinks and acts as a patriotic statesman. But the greatest of all his assets, values, and characteristics is simply this: he decides all questions as to his decisions and his actions by a sense of moral values as his basic criterion. His first question about any projected course is not, is it expedient or is it smart, but is it right? Then, if the answer is yes, it's right, he puts, as Ezra Taft Benson said, we must, the strength and action behind it. And he then proceeds in full confidence that in the conduct of human affairs, morality sees further than intellect. That, ladies and gentlemen, we published in the first editorial in the first issue of what's now American Opinion 7 years ago. Morality sees further than intellect. And this gentleman believes and follows that principle. That has been a basic principle of the John Birch Society since it was founded. And you see, why we are so glad to have this man now as the district governor of the society for the 6 Pacific Coast states. And with a great deal of pleasure and pride, I present to you this great American, the Honorable John Rousselot.
Bob Welch, thank you for a very kind introduction. As many of you know here in Massachusetts, because you have known him in business and other activities. When Bob Welch stands up and talks about how the intent of the left wing to displace me in Congress, I really take a second seat to him and the kind of attack that the collectivist movement has levied on this man. I want to say that I am proud to have been introduced by Bob Welch and to participate in this very fine God and Country rally that the people here in Boston, the good people here in Boston, decided it was about time to undertake as a task, because there seems to be a little drift here in this area, in the so-called intellectual area. And so I am delighted that they have decided that the time has come, the policemen and the others, Mrs. McKinney, who decided that the time had come to begin to alert the people here. It was rather strange that this was the cradle of our liberty system here, our republic, and that we now find that in this area of the country there seems to be less interest by the general public in what is really occurring. I also wish to acknowledge the fine remarks by Colonel Bunker and by the others that have participated in this particular rally to bring to our attention many things that I did not know, things that we have to be alert to, things that we have to do if we are going to participate as true patriots in doing something about it. I have chosen a subject which I have called Disarmament, a Blueprint for Surrender, because that is exactly what your government is engaged in doing right now. As quickly as possible, merging our armed forces under the United Nations command and relinquishing the sovereignty of our country and the right to protect ourselves. And I hope the newspaper men are still here and will take these notes and print it, though I understand in this town that's not always the case. Because we are facing in this country a very disastrous policy. If the policy that is now implemented by the State Department and the United States Arms Control and Disarmament Agency is carried out, and frankly was granted to them by the Congress a year ago, 1961. Now, I am not here to put all of you to sleep or to make you think that everything is just fine, because it is not. Many of the speakers that have preceded me have covered other areas, but I honestly believe that the best thing that you and I can do, not only for the God that we worship, but for the country that protects our right to worship that God, that we take greater security measures to make sure that we have an army, if necessary, to defend that right should that need ever come. And the direction that we are now taking is exactly opposite to that. I will not try to furbish this up with a lot of beautiful statements or intellectual things. Everything that I tell you today can be well documented, and I hope that our good newspaper profession that's here today will look these things up. And in case they don't have the time to do it, American Opinion will publish next month an article by me on this subject of disarmament, and every single thing that I will tell you today can be well documented and is being undertaken by our government. The present policy of our State Department is as follows. Your State Department. Remember, it's the State Department of our country, or it is supposed to reflect that general opinion. The policy of the State Department of the United States today is to pursue with all diligent speed a policy of general and complete disarmament of our armed forces and to merge it under the control of the United Nations. Some of us think that that's not a very wise policy because the Undersecretary General for Political and Security Affairs of the United Nations is a communist general. Since that position has been established, there has never been anyone that has filled that position other than a communist. And some of us think that it isn't very wise to put our armed forces under the control of a communist. We just don't think that would be the right thing to do. Now, our State Department, in all of its many bulletins, along with the United States Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, created by the New Frontier last year, has been working to find an area of accommodation in the field of disarmament and to merge with Russia in finding ways to accomplish complete and total disarmament. Now, this hasn't just occurred all at once, but I make the following charge. Our country today is following the exact same policy recommended by the communists in 1955. And we are with great speed implementing every single platform in the communist recommendations for disarmament right now, this moment. And so let's document this case so that somebody can't say we're hysterical or that we're extremists, because we're not. We're just concerned as to the direction that our government is taking us in this field. In 1955, in major addresses before the United Nations and other so-called international organizations, many of the communists proposed to the world that all nations reduce their armaments and eliminate all major armed forces to put them under the control of the United Nations. There weren't many people that followed up on this proposal, except Adlai Stevenson in 1956 in his campaign included portions of that same program in his platform and in his discussions, as you will recall during that campaign. But to show you the effectiveness of the communist conspiracy in imposing that policy, their policy, on our country, let me now trace the events that have occurred since that time. In 1958 and 59, members of Congress suddenly found out that in the Pentagon of the United States there existed a major file called Strategic Surrender. This file was designed by some of our so-called educational institutions and research institutions in this country, with your tax money in mind, to provide a way for our country to systematically and, quote, strategically surrender our armed forces to the United Nations control. This folder still sits in the Pentagon, and if it had not been for certain congressmen, Congressman Donald Jackson from my own state, I am not sure that we would know about that file today. But sitting in our Defense Department are files that provide for a systematic surrender of all of our armed forces and the procedures that our Defense Department would provide in this kind of an instance. Well, I don't think that America has ever talked or even thought of surrender, and we wouldn't have to if we didn't have these kind of thinkers in our government. This particular surrender file was designed by the Rand Corporation in California, Johns Hopkins University under the direction of Mr. Milton Eisenhower, and several other groups who, and by the way, Milton Eisenhower was the one who recommended to his brother that this particular file be designed and be set in our files for the day that we might need it, as we were told at that time. And so this file today sits there. People like Adam Yarmolinsky and Mr. Sylvester and others are now the keepers of these kind of proposals in our Pentagon. Then in 1959, of September of 59, Mr. Khrushchev went before the United Nations. Mr. Khrushchev gave a major address called a Russian proposal for general and complete disarmament in an international world. Now, I want you to notice the topic of this particular subject because you will see it pop up again and again. Mr. Khrushchev, in a over an hour and a half address, gave this speech before the United Nations. In that particular proposal that he made, he called for a 3-stage disarmament program for the world. And the 3rd stage called for the complete implementation of the United Nations to gain control of all armed forces of the world. Now, he said nothing about, of course, the Russians or the communists having their armed forces under this control. Why would they worry as long as they have communist generals heading the armed forces of the military forces of the United Nations, which is the ultimate control resides in a communist today. And by the way, this was an agreement that was arrived at in 1945 by Alger Hiss and other members that helped negotiate the original terms of the United Nations. People say, how do you know that? Mr. Trygve Lie, in his book, The Cause for Peace, fully describes in that book, The Cause for Peace, on page 45, how Alger Hiss, Harry Dexter White, and others persuaded the other big 5 powers to agree to have the Undersecretary General for Political and Security Affairs in the United Nations always be a person of Russian extraction and or whoever the communists designated. And our country agreed to that. It is a verbal agreement. It has never been withdrawn. We have never tried to withdraw it. And so to this day, a Russian general or a Czech general has always headed the military forces of the United Nations. This is why Mr. MacArthur objected slightly to General MacArthur to submitting his Korean War plans to our Pentagon, because he knew in turn they had to go through the United Nations to get approval. And he just didn't think that a Russian general was the proper place to send it for final approval. Now, Mr. Khrushchev in this speech called for this 3-stage program for general and complete disarmament in September of 1959. In November of 1960, right after the election of Mr. Kennedy, he dispatched Mr. Walter Rostow from MIT, I believe, very close to you here in Boston. And he dispatched Mr. Walter Rostow, who is well known for his general socialistic approach to world government, to Moscow to find the areas of agreement between our country and the communists, to find out that even before he went into office, if there weren't some areas of, quote, accommodation that our country could arrive at in the field of disarmament. Mr. Rostow returned from that trip convinced that the Russians were mad at us because we had too powerful weapons, and that if we would just begin to phase out what are known as our first strike weapon systems, that the communists would be more than willing to begin to sit down and start talking about disarmament. You remember Mr. Kennedy was very disturbed in his campaign that we hadn't progressed enough, as he said, in the field of disarmament. And so even before he was in office, he dispatched Mr. Rostow. Mr. Rostow returned with this general thesis, and he wrote it in a white paper that was immediately circulated among all of the potential officers in the new Kennedy administration. And it was this: that if we would just begin to phase out our first strike weapon systems, such as SAC, our other bomber programs, our various missile systems, if we would just begin to phase these out and show, quote, good faith, the communists would be more than willing to sit down and talk about a general agreement on disarmament. I imagine they would. And so this was written in a white paper which was circulated among the State Department and other places and became the immediate and general policy of the new administration. Then in March of 1961, the Council of Foreign Relations dispatched a, quote, citizens committee to the Crimea to discuss with Soviet citizens the general topic of disarmament. This was given the approval by our State Department, and they said that even though it was not an official function of the federal government, that they would be delighted to have the results of that conference in the Crimea. Such people as Marian Anderson, who makes a fine singer. I don't know what she knows about disarmament. She was part of this group. I don't know what qualified her to talk about disarmament, but she went to the Crimea to talk with other dedicated communists as to the areas of agreement. The areas of agreement that we might find with the communist conspiracy. I want to make it clear for the newspaper men here that I made no implication Mrs. Anderson is a communist or anything like it. I just don't know how she is capable of dealing in a very tough field of disarmament or in the field of armament and talking with other communists on how we can arrive at areas of agreement. This particular group returned and again wrote up a white paper with the help of the staff of the Council of Foreign Relations, that great patriotic group, and that Mr. Courtney, I'm sure, has told you about, and I hope you'll buy his book in the other room because he'll tell you about the Council of Foreign Relations as a former administrative assistant to J. Edgar Hoover, Dan Smoot, has tried to do in his book. But in this particular white paper, the citizens of our country who went, Arthur Dean was another, all agreed that there were many areas of agreement between ourselves and the communists, and all we had to do was to agree to these proposals that the communists had suggested, and that we would readily find a disarmament treaty available to us. Then in April of 1961, Mr. Kennedy met himself with Mr. Khrushchev. We now know, because we've been able to get some so-called control leaks, that in that discussion with Mr. Khrushchev, that the subject of disarmament was discussed. And Mr. Khrushchev found out that our president was more than willing to find areas of accommodation in the field of disarmament and agree to some kind of a three-stage program for total disarmament. Next point. In the spring of 1961, Mr. Adam Yarmolinsky, who had been appointed as a special assistant to Mr. McNamara, and Mr. Sylvester, the new public affairs director at the Pentagon, began to quote, as they said before our congressional committees, tone down the philosophical training programs of our troops because they were too distorted and a little hysterical. So they then began to put some of the training films on the shelf, such as Operation Abolition or Communism on the Map or other programs to philosophically train our troops. And they replaced them with some of the films that talked about the fields of disarmament and the areas of agreement between ourselves and the communists. And so many of us became concerned, including Senator Strom Thurmond, who saw Adam Yarmolinsky, who, by the way, was a member of the Communist Youth League during his younger days, and we don't think that this is the best type of leadership to bring to the Defense Department. That's the right of the Kennedy administration to do it, but some of us think that that's bad judgment. That these kind of people were beginning to implement the policies within our military and encouraging a complete discouragement of any military officers who wanted to speak up and say that they felt that our State Department was imposing a program of phasing out our military programs and our ability to be able to defend ourselves. Then the pressure began in the spring of 1961 by our State Department. They put out a booklet called Freedom from War. Now, if you haven't had a chance to write for that booklet, write for the booklet Freedom from War for our State Department, because in it, and it was published and sent to all the congressmen, and great agitation began then in the Congress to implement this program by legislation. It was interesting to note that only 1 year and a half after Mr. Khrushchev's speech, that the State Department was publishing a booklet that was almost identical to the speech that Mr. Khrushchev gave in 1949. This booklet, Freedom from War, called for a three-stage program of phase-out of our military forces, and the final stage to put them under the control of the United Nations military force, and to completely, eventually eliminate the necessity of any armed forces in our country. And the State Department told us this could be done in 6 to 9 years, although we know that they're planning to accelerate it a lot more quickly than that. And in this booklet, they fully define how that our country in 6 to 9 years, and that was, you must remember, almost well over a year ago now, and they've had the legislation to implement this program, that they felt that we should have in this country nothing but a very small police force in each community which could put down any rebellions or anybody who might object to any policies that we have, and that the basic military force of our country that you and I would pay for would be under the complete control of the United Nations. People say, well, this couldn't happen in this country, but let me just tell you this. Immediately following the publication of that booklet, the State Department came to the Congress of the United States and presented the United States Arms Control and Disarmament Agency Act, which was passed in the fall of '61, and gave the State Department and this new agency head, without necessarily the consent of the President or the Senate, the full control to negotiate all treaties for total and complete disarmament and to put our armed forces under the control of the United Nations. That authority now rests with this newly created agency, the United States Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. And they try to tell you, well, there's a couple of sections in there that prevent it, but they do not. The law is clear. Now imagine if you had been a United Nations delegate and you had sat there 2 years before and heard Mr. Khrushchev propose this, and then 2 years later the President of the United States come before you and say, this is our proposal, and this is a new and brilliant proposal for total disarmament. We're going to put the United Nations in control of this. This is our program. How stupid our country must have looked in the eyes of the rest of the United Nations delegate. We were proposing the exact same thing that Mr. Khrushchev had proposed 2 years before. And people then wonder, they say, well, John, why do you think we're in trouble? And I mean that sincerely. Why are we in trouble? Because we follow the pattern that the communists set for us time and time again, respond for it. And they get our President of our United States to help them by surrounding him with a fuzzy professors who know nothing about disarmament. Now, some of you will think, well, these are very harsh terms. They are very harsh terms, but these are very harsh times. We are losing this battle rapidly, and we are not going to win unless more Americans are alert and make demands of their public officials that we quit selling this country out a bit at a time. To continue, in the winter of 1962, the Defense Department under Mr. McNamara and Mr. Adam Yarmolinsky and Mr. Sylvester and all the rest of the great people that came there, they began an intensive program to phase out our first strike weapon systems. Only some of it has cropped to the surface so that the general public is aware of it. You have just seen one recent sign with a complete cancellation of the Skybolt program, which is a first strike weapon system that gives us a tremendous capability to keep the communists in check, and they know it. And this is why they are encouraging us to cancel it. None of us like to have heavy armaments, but we know that that is one thing that the communists understand. And this is just one more phase out of a first strike weapon system to soften up our country, to give them a greater advantage, and to make the rest of the world sit up and take notice that where we talk about standing firm with our allies, in the meantime, we're phasing out the Thor program in England. We're beginning to phase out our bomber programs in the South Pacific. We have all but canceled the future continuation of the RS-70 program, which is one of the most sophisticated bomber systems that has ever been developed by our country. A Mach 3 bomber that is capable, which means going 3 times the speed of sound, capable of launching a vast number of missiles in many directions, a tremendous speed weapon, giving us great capability in the sky, very similar to the atomic submarine program, only this would be in the sky, tremendous capability, and the Congress was asked to begin to phase this program out last year, and thank goodness they refused to cut the money. They went ahead and fought for it anyway, but of course this administration hasn't spent hardly any money on it, and they are not going to continue the further development of these RS-70 programs. These are only a few examples, and there are many more, of where the implementation of the communist conspiracy idea that we begin to phase out our first strike weapon system has now been carried out and is being carried out by our leaders in our country in exact response to the Russian suggestion that if you will just phase out your first strike weapon systems, somehow we'll like you better and somehow we'll be able to sit down with you and talk about disarmament. Well, of course they'll be able to talk about disarmament, because if it's under the control, first of all, of the United Nations, secondly, we're phasing out our ability to protect ourselves, they'll be delighted to talk about disarmament, because all they have to do is send the Chinese troops, the over 8,000 that there are in Cuba today, up the coast. And I'm sure that it wouldn't take much to get that started if Mr. Castro decided that he had the ability to do it. Now, another thing. In these first stage weapon systems, our military has resisted this all the way. Not because they're trying to maintain themselves in power, but they do understand one thing, and that is military ability to attack and protect ourselves. And they know that is necessary. And yet, this administration, and partially the past administration, have been susceptible to the suggestions that if somehow we phase out our first weapon systems, that we will be able to better get along with the communist conspiracy. Now, following this, Mr. Arthur Dean, who had been such a great negotiator at Korea that he was not able to get back most of our prisoners. As a matter of fact, there's still about 2,000 prisoners of ours in Korea. Mr. Arthur Dean was dispatched to Geneva with a treaty on disarmament. Now, it's interesting, and I hope you will write for this particular treaty from the United States Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, which Mr. Dean was representing along with Mr. Russ. This treaty, drafted in our State Department, drafted by us, was a 3-stage program for general and complete disarmament. And that is now exactly the same as Mr. Khrushchev's proposal in 1959. That is now the treaty that is being negotiated at Geneva. Even though this new agency has the power to go ahead with it anyway, they are still going through the motions of getting a treaty, and it is my understanding that it is only a matter of 5 to 6 months before we agree to this treaty. You notice the Russians have been refusing to sign it because it has too many proposals for mutual inspection, and of course they don't want that. And naturally, they are resisting this treaty because they know that we will continually capitulate, and now we're down to 5 inspection stations. I imagine soon we'll be down to less, and maybe even none. And Mr. Dean, I understand, has now resigned, but we are pushing ahead as a country to try and get the Russians to accept their proposal for a treaty in Geneva. Now, I have not meant to sound sarcastic. It is just unbelievable how our country has followed the exact pattern and suggestions of the communist conspiracy, and it can't all be a mistake. So people say, what can I do as an individual citizen? I feel powerless. I have little that I can do. I think there are many things that we must agitate and work for and insist upon. We have the right, and as individual citizens, we can bear upon the weight of of public opinion if we will just stand up and be counted. Sure, we'll be in a minority for a while. It will not be an easy battle to win, but here are a few of the suggestions that I think we must carry out. One, I think it is important that we have and agitate in the Congress to have a full-scale investigation of the State Department to find out why they've made all these mistakes. Now, we have every right as a Congress or as people to demand of our Congress that they find out why our State Department and these other agencies have continued to make these same mistakes over and over. And instead of promoting the people like Mr. Weiland and others, that we begin to do something about eliminating those people who have made these mistakes over and over and begin to demand a more competent group of people in our State Department. And so I think we need a full-scale investigation. Secondly, I think we must demand that our Congress withhold any future funds to the United Nations until it is determined how the money is being spent, whether it is really being spent in behalf of to any degree in favor of the free world. For instance, few of us are disturbed that it's never been reported in the New York Times on very many occasions, that great publication of truth, as we are told, or even in your local papers, that Mr. Outhant, who is the Secretary General of this organization, has been an avowed Marxist for 25 years. Now, why hasn't this been brought out? And so are we surprised at the things that he's doing in the Congo? Why should we pay our good American taxpayers' money for this kind of ridiculous leadership in the United Nations? And so I think we must withhold our financial participation in this organization until it truly turns out to be, if it could, a system or a facility for true discussion, which I don't think it can be, with 33% of the civil servants communists or from communist countries. And I think we are making a mistake by putting so much faith in this Trojan horse. In addition to that, I think that we must withdraw, as we have done in the past, diplomatic relations from all communist countries because they are outlaw nations. So many people say, well, this is a negative action. Yes, it's a negative action but in the long run, it is a positive action. We withdrew diplomatic relations from other outlaw nations, such as Nazi Germany or others, when they acted improperly. Now, why are we taking so long to realize that Mr. Khrushchev means what he says when he says, we will bury you, and that this is an outlaw nation? They haven't kept any single basic principle of the Charter of the United Nations. We have had over 62 agreements with this country. They haven't kept one. Why should we believe and continue in diplomatic relations which gives them the right to borrow money from this country? They get it anyway through foreign aid and other ways. But why should we continue diplomatic relations with an outlaw nation? It's like trying to sit down and say with Mr. Al Capone or the police department during the time in Chicago, saying, Mr. Capone, let's sit down and negotiate and see whether you're going to shoot anybody this week. That's just how silly it is. And that's exactly what we have led ourselves into believing. And I think we must withdraw diplomatic relations to show the rest of the world, especially those who want to be free, that we mean business, that we mean what we say. We are not going to coexist with a communist conspiracy in any respect. Fourth, I think we have to encourage others to better understand Congressman Utt from California's Liberty Amendment. You've heard Willis Stone speak about this. Many people say we can't get the people to understand that. That is false. In polls that I took in my district, we sent out thousands of questionnaires, over 100,000, had a tremendous response, better than 22,000, and 78% of the people who responded to that said, yes, I think you should support the Liberty Amendment. Why? Because they understood that it was ridiculous to use their income tax money for the promotion of these 19,000 businesses that are in direct competition with their jobs and put people out of work, and by the way, aren't managed very well and cause debt in the federal government. And so I think we have to begin to stand up and fight for the Liberty Amendment, because it was what our founding fathers intended, that we have taxation with representation, and the income tax is not taxation with representation, and we ought to face up to that. Now, why is this important? Because most of these businesses are in the Defense Department and are promoting all kinds of research projects that have little relation to properly defending ourselves. And I think this would be one of the best things to begin to shake up our Pentagon and put it back in the hands of people who really are there for the purpose of defending our country and not giving away the sovereignty of our armed forces. Finally, we have to have more meetings like this today. It'll take time. We aren't going to... People say, well, there isn't enough time. There is enough time. Each of us, if we went out of here today, help Mrs. McKinney put out another one, say, in 6 months, another such program, and we each brought in 5 or 4 friends who are uninformed, who don't know, and get them to come and listen to what's happening to their country. We aren't here because we want to be hysterical, but because we are concerned. We are losing this battle because not enough Americans, or apathetic Americans, are allowing it to go by default. And that is one reason that I am going to give my full time to the John Birch Society, because it's one of the finest organizations that I have seen doing something about the communist conspiracy. Now, because the tendency sometimes has been to shy away about the discussion of some of the fine things that Bob Welch has said, I want to quote for you something that he said in 1958, because he was right, and more people ought to understand that he's not only been right, but on many things he has predicted with certainty what was going to happen. Sukarno, Castro, he was talking about these things in one man's opinion or American opinion clear back in 57, 58. And we should have been listening, but we weren't. He said in 1958, as you look more and more carefully into the hopes that have been bred and the disappointments that have been followed throughout the political performance of those 20 years, you come increasingly to realize the wisdom of the old advice. Put not your faith in politicians. We shall have to use politicians, support politicians, create politicians, and help the best ones we can find to get elected. I am thoroughly convinced, however, that we cannot count on all politicians, political leadership, or even political action, except as a part of something more deeper, much deeper and broader to save us. Now, what is that deeper and more broader thing that Bob Welch was referring to, Mr. Benson was referring to, and many of you came here today because you believed in it? Mrs. McKinney referred to it last night. The spiritual values and the belief in God that made this country great. That's the something deeper that we need to return to this country. An understanding that this country was founded on the concept that there is a God and that our Constitution was divinely inspired. You recall Mr. Franklin stood on the floor after there had been days of confusion in the convention. They had been able to get nowhere in trying to bring about a new instrument of government. And Mr. Franklin said, we have begun wrong. From now on, I suggest we start each day with a prayer and ask for guidance as to how we can construct a proper country. And from that day forward, they did that. And they designed the highest form of government that mankind has ever known, our Constitution, that gave us the freedom to speak up and to be different and to participate, and more important, to worship as we see fit. Now, I'd like to close by reading a statement. We do not know who the author is, but I think it exemplifies the quality that we need to reestablish not only in our own lives, but to encourage our neighbors to begin to reestablish if we are truly going to save this country. And I mean save it. It's called One Solitary Life. He was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in still another village, where he worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30. Then for 3 years, he was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never had a family or owned a house. He didn't go to college. He never visited a big city. He never traveled 200 miles from the place where he was born. He did none of the things that one usually associates with greatness. He had no credentials but himself. He was only 33 when the tide of public opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. He was turned over to his enemies and went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed to a cross between two thieves. While he was dying, his executioners gambled for his clothing, the only property he had on earth. When he had passed away, he was laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. 19 centuries have come and gone, and today he is the central figure of the human race and the leader of mankind's progress. All the armies that ever marched, all the navies that ever sailed, all the parliaments that ever sat, all the kings that ever reigned, put together, have not affected the life of man on this earth as much as that one solitary life. Now we ask, what can I do? Each in our own way are going to have this same quality of devotion, morality, strength, spiritual activity if we are going to save this country, and that means being controversial if you think you are right and standing alone, if that is necessary, to fight for what is right and to put this country back on the right track. We need everybody in this room. No one can be excluded. Won't you join us, these many movements that are here today, to help us put your country, our country, back on the right track? Thanks very much. I want to make sure of one thing, make sure the correction was understood. I did not mean to imply and have not implied that Marian Anderson is a communist or ever has been. I merely said that she sat down in the Crimea with communists, we know that, and talked about the subject of disarmament. So that the record can be clear, the Colonel suggested I make sure that that was understood. Let me say that I appreciate very much the wonderful work that the people here have done. Both my wife Marilyn and I have enjoyed being with you, and we shall continue, as you are doing here, to do our part in the fight for freedom in California. Thank you.